We continue with session 2 of the Diversity and Inclusion Identity work sessions. This is Professor Nasima Mohammed Hussain Carrim. The focus is to develop diversity and inclusion. So we are still busy with session 2. The prescribed book that you can use to access these slides and the information on the slides is Managing Diversity in a South African Workplace, and together with Dr. Leon Moelman, one of the editors. So now we're going to look at chapter 4, Managing Racial and Ethnic Diversity in the Workplace in South Africa. So after studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following: understand and be able to describe race, racism, everyday racism, white privilege, ethnicity, and xeno-racism. Recognize how workplace cultures and practices are racialized. Comprehend microaggressions and how they manifest in a workplace. Understand how racialized cultures and practices intersect with gender. Describe the relationship between employment equity, transformation, and diversity. Understand critical diversity literacy as a framework for managing racial and ethnic diversity in the workplace. So, race and racism in contemporary South Africa. The implementation of employment equity in senior and top managerial positions, especially within the private sector, is still a major contention issues. We know that most of the managers within the corporate environment are male, and together with that, it's mostly South African white male. So this is a challenge in the public sector, where gender equity is also a major issue. While there are more black males within the public sector, there are very few women who are actually in top and senior management positions within the public sector. So both the public and the private sector have challenges, but the challenge in the public sector is more related to gender, whereas in the private sector it's related to race and gender. And we find that white South Africans also earn 1 to 1.5 times more than Indians or Asians, and 5 times more than black Africans. And unemployment and poverty, if we look at those statistics, they are also racially skewed. And poverty is also as a result of colonialism and apartheid, and currently it is deepened through economic policies due to government policies. Now we look at table 4.1 in the textbook. Also we see that the occupational levels by race and that within the sectors and that we find that within the period of 2001 to 2017, especially we look at top managerial positions as well, there were 87% of whites who occupied that position. In 2017 it dropped to 67%, and whereas the if you look at the Africans, they were 6% in 2001 in top management position, and today they're 14.3%. Now we look at the statistics of 2001 in terms of senior management. 81% were whites, and in 2017 it dropped to 56.1%. And then the African population representation at senior management was 9%, and it increased to 22.1% in 2017. So we still find that there is covert and overt racism, which contributes to lack of retaining black, especially previously disadvantaged employees. And when we talk about covert and overt racism, overt means that they blatantly discriminated, and people blatantly show racism against previously disadvantaged individuals. Covert racism, then here we are discussing things that are very subtle. People do things in a subtle manner and they don't show it openly. And black employees and their abilities are undermined to contribute towards the advancement of the organization. So we look at the theoretical framing, it's called critical race theory, and this theory basically focuses on making sense of race and racism. So CRT is a way of thinking about race and racism which challenges the way in which race and racial power are constructed and represented. So if we look at race and racism, and that it operates on four basic assumptions. The first one is that racism is ordinary. It does make it difficult to identify and to address. So people accept it as a ordinary phenomena. And then secondly is racism advances the interests of white people, meaning that they have little motivation to intervene in it. So at the end of the day, if some theory or some phenomena advances a particular nation, obviously they're not going to do anything to curb that or to change the status quo in any way. And that is what their sentence means. Then thirdly, race and racism are products of a social process and are not based in any biological or scientific reality. That is also true. Race is a very contentious issue these days, where scientists and scholars believe that it's not something you cannot identify a person of a mixed race group, for example, and say this person is that particular person. For example, I went to Brazil and I found the Brazilians look a lot like Indians in it. Although I'm Indian, I couldn't really make out whether they were Indian or Brazilian in it. So that is why they say race is actually a socially constructed phenomena, and it is not based on one's biology or a scientific reality. It is based on how we see race, how we portray race. And then the fourth argument is that no person will ever be defined in terms of simply their race. So yes, that's true, because race intersects with a lot of other identities such as gender, socioeconomic class, and sexual orientation to actually make people either very subordinate within a particular society, or it raises them up and gives them certain privileges. So then what is race? So during the apartheid era, race was classified in terms of the population registration. This is where uh, people had to go through the pencil test. So if the pencil fell out from your hair quickly enough, then you will be classified as white. But if it got stuck in your hair, you're either colored or you're African. So the race, according to during the apartheid era, race was divided into white, black, and colored. At first, Indian fell under colored, and then thereafter they had their own racial category, namely Indian. So there were a lot of confusion also, because sometimes people within one family were thrown apart. So sometimes family members had to live in separate suburbs, and because some were classified as white, others were classified as colored, and yet others were classified as Indian. So a lot of parents were separated from their children as well. There are two discourses of race, namely essentialism, that is that race is based on biology, and whites are like this and they have certain characteristics in it, and blacks have other characteristics. Then the second one is the color blindness element. And since the end of apartheid, race is no longer politically significant, and therefore any use or recognition of the concept is itself a racist practice harking back to apartheid. This means I don't see race, race doesn't matter. And this is also then an aspect that essentially says that I don't see race. But the thing is that you have to agree that race does exist. People do come from different race groups, whether they are from one race group or mixed race group in it, they do belong to a certain race. So we cannot just say race was a phenomena or part of apartheid. It is currently also impacting a lot of decisions within the workplace. So in terms of essentialism, certain groups of people share certain social and cultural characteristics due to their race. And this can never change because these social and cultural differences are rooted in biology. So this is according to essentialism, it means that it is because you have a certain biology, that is why you have certain social and cultural values. And this way of understanding race and racism doesn't recognize, and it doesn't critically analyze the political and social history of race and how it was used to systematically dehumanize black people. Therefore, racism is not seen as a problem, but rather just the way things are. So this is a very wrong way of looking at race, because if you say if black people are oppressed and they are living in poverty, and that, there's, according to this particular perspective and viewpoint, people will say yes, it's because of your biology, because you were born black. But they don't look at how the apartheid system and also colonialism actually brought about this dehumanizing of people. Then the colorblind, this theory also says that there is no such a thing as race. But then here, once again, it doesn't also look at the political and social history of race. And once again, it doesn't look at how it dehumanizes not only black people, but it also dehumanizes people of color. So this then results in the psychological, social, cultural, political, and economic consequences of the logic of race and racism are not considered in this understanding of race, because there is a certain psychology that was actually practiced during apartheid, and that was to make people who were disadvantaged, people of color, feel that they are not good enough. They're not good enough to become managers, they are not good enough to become doctors, lawyers, accountants, and that is why certain categories of jobs, for example, becoming working as an engineer, that in certain fields were closed actually to people of color. So people of color mostly went into the medical field. They became teachers, they became doctors, lawyers, pharmacists. However, they could not own factories during that time. They could not own mines. They could not also own much land to do major farming in that. So certain professions were actually closed to them. They couldn't become industrial psychologists either. They couldn't become HR personnel, because those type of careers were reserved for white people. And they couldn't also, a lot of them couldn't become accountants and work in white companies as well, because they were made to feel inferior. You're not good enough to become an accountant, because accountants work with figures, and you, as a person of color, you are not good at figures. So then when you look at critical race theorists, they advocate for anti-racist approach. So anti-racism understands that race is socially constructed and embedded in history and politics, and is fluid and changing rather than fixed, and gives it meaning. So basically, uh, race changes constantly. I don't believe there is a pure race, speaking in this day and age. There is no pure race, because somewhere along the line, races have mixed, moving around continents and that. And this draws our attention to the meaning we attach to real or imagined biological and cultural markers, and enables us to recognize the hierarchies of power and privilege located within racialized structures of meaning. So what this means is that obviously when you are of a certain race, a person who's a white male, for example, you will have certain privileges compared to somebody who is a black female, and who is, for example, a lesbian. She will have fewer privileges compared to you, who are not a homosexual person, for example. So it also allows us to recognize that race is not scientifically valid category, but that does not make race an illusion, because race is a reality. And people, somebody put it very a very nice saying. They said, we are just different shades of a color. So where we start off with a white pale complexion, and we go to a brown complexion, and we eventually end up with a black complexion. But it's all different shades of humankind. So that is how people should be seen, as different shades of humankind. We all belong to one humankind, one society, one ancestor, basically. So the definition of racism is also a contested issue. That means different groups of people with different social, cultural, political, and economic interests are competing to define the concept. There is no fixed meaning to the term racism. So, for example, inside a colorblind understanding, talking about race or the ideas of black or white people is racism. The solution is not to talk about about it. Instead, inside an essentialist understanding, the idea of race and white people and black people is not considered a problem at all. So this is where all the differences come in as well, with the definition of race and racism. So let's talk about racism, everyday racism and microaggressions. So an anti-racist perspective will say that racism is a form of oppression in which one racial group dominates others. So in South Africa, the dominant group is white, therefore racism is white racial prejudice and discrimination, supported intentionally or unintentionally by institutional power and authority, and used to the advantage of whites and the disadvantage of people of color. Now we see this happening in South Africa as well, with the hashtag Colored Lives Matter and hashtag Black Lives Matter movements. And we also notice that there's been recently a lot of racial prejudice and discrimination taking place, especially when we look at the advertisement, the hair advertisement, hair product advertisements from Clicks and Net. There's major uproar where a lot of political parties are upset by that particular um, hair advertisement as well. We see how police have shot a young teenage boy, a colored boy as well, um, who was basically um, disabled. So at the end of the day, we see a lot of racism also taking place within South Africa, and this even within the states, the hashtag Black Lives movement, where a white policeman also killed a black individual. So we see this taking place in society, and the media is full up, especially with anti-racial and anti-racism campaigns, and somehow or the other racism has been highlighted, especially during the COVID-19 lockdown. Then economic resources also reside in the hands of the white minority, and within South Africa, universities in the private sector are still dominated by white people, and there are Eurocentric norms and values. So basically, the white group is seen dominant, but not only in South Africa, like I explained, in the USA as well as in Europe and in Australia as well. So for an act to be seen racist, it must be supported institutionally and structurally. This implies that there is to be a history of systematic discrimination, which has resulted in economic relations and cultural norms and values that have placed one racial group at an advantage over another group. Now, this is definitely the case in South Africa, where the apartheid regime in the apartheid system places whites above all other black people. And, and it has been so entrenched within our society that it is still difficult to get away from it. In a lot of organizations and institutions, we still see a lot of racism taking place, not only in the private sector but at universities as well, and in certain schools as well, where racism still dominates. And then this act can be intentional or it can be unintentional. Sometimes people are racist unintentionally, and they don't even realize it. So this is the thing about racism, that um, intentionality is not required for racism. It happens. So unintentionally also it can take place. And we have seen this as evidence also, where a few years ago some students also dressed up as black individuals, and this was seen as very offensive towards black people, and that because of certain connotations that went up with that particular dress type. So racism is not always overt, it is not always there in your face. It can also be very subtle. And sometimes people do it in such a subtle manner that it sometimes takes you time to realize that this particular person is racist. People don't always come out openly about it and blatantly about it. So sometimes it can be policies within organizations or cultural norms within the organization where people display racism, but it is so subtle that sometimes it is very difficult to even pick up. So everyday racism injustices occurring so often that they are almost taken for granted, and they seem small injustices, and then sometimes when you think about it and you ask yourself, is it really worth it fighting against the system, because it seems so trivial, but it is there. For example, like one of your colleagues would say to you that you are promoted, say for example within the organization, and the person will say, oh, but then you have somehow or the other you are starting to dress nicely and all that, and is it because of your promotion and that, and but always I always say that even if you look good from outside, you display that same integrity and that same level of intellect from inside. And this in itself is an act of racism. So if a black person gets promoted and you kind of hear all these snide remarks, where a person will also come out sometimes openly and say, but you are a window dresser, and comment on your dressing and all that. A window dresser, if you get promoted, and then comment on the way you dress now because you're promoted in it. Those are all everyday acts of racism. And you sometimes wonder, like, how can you fight against all this racism in it? It seems so silly to go to your manager and say, she's insulting me about the way I look or the way I dress and that because now I'm promoted. But when you think about it, it kind of makes you feel stupid. But these are all things that actually undermine an individual. And then microaggressive behaviors are also brief and daily verbal and behavioral or environmental indignities. Whether they are intentional or unintentional, they still communicate a very hostile and negative racial, gender, or sexual um, slurs and insults. So when we talk about microaggressive behavior, it could be something like, uh, uh, um, a person from another racial group would ask an Indian male or female, now, when are you bringing samosas and that for us? So the Indian person will think, am I only good to bring samosas to work, and then, and why do you stereotype me as somebody who makes samosas and would want to bring samosas to the workplace and that. I interviewed an Indian male at one stage. Related to my research, and he said, you know what, he told his colleague who was from another racial group, and she said, oh, when are you bringing samosas to work, and that he said, I'm sorry, but I'm a manager, yeah, I don't make samosas. So it's those type of behaviors that actually communicate in a subtle manner the racism and the stereotyping and actually microaggressive behaviors to people of different race groups or genders or people who are of a different religious group and different sexual orientation as well. So let's look at the concept of whiteness and white privilege. So whiteness is a way of thinking and talking about the world that locates white and European ways of being and doing as an invisible norm, an ideal by which all other people are measured. So whiteness is regarded as being normal, and everything else that is not white is regarded as being the other. So if we look at black bodies in that, the white bodies and their cultural practices are more aligned to the norm, whereas black bodies are just the opposite. I once heard Muhammad Ali having an interview, and the interviewer, and he was just telling the interview, he would he asked his mother, why is everything that is white good? Why is everything that is black evil and bad? You know, mm, so the thing is, at the end of the day, he was trying to point out how people are socialized into thinking that everything that is white is normal and there is goodness in it, but everything that is black is evil, and there is no goodness in it. So that for me was a very interesting interview that Muhammad Ali, the boxer, the late boxer, had, and it just shows that he thought about whiteness and white privilege as well. And with whiteness and white privilege comes a lot of power as well, and privileges, which people who are regarded as the other do not have in society and in institutions. When you ask white people also, like, how they see themselves in it, they kind of like don't realize that they are privileged, that certain things are denied to certain people, which they also take for granted. So when we look at the invisible knapsack, also white people are oblivious to the privileges they have. It means that one has had privileges that others have not, and it's so taken for granted and is regarded as so normal that they don't even consciously think about having all those privileges as well. It's kind of taken for granted, and it's a given. So let's look at now ethnicity and xeno-racism. So ethnicity is basically dealing with culture, but cultural and racial norms, and it forms part of individuals' identities. So it is your language, your culture, your religion, where you come from. There are different ethnicities in South Africa as well. You get even among the black African people, you get different ethnicities. You get the Pedi people, the Zulu people. You get the people, Xhosa people, and each ethnic group has certain values that they follow in certain cultural norms that are different and unique to them compared to the other ethnic groups within South Africa. So when you look at the logic of ethnicity, and it is not really that dissimilar to the logic of race. First of all, that it says that people who are from different ethnic origins are also like a race, biologically different, and that this difference denotes superiority of the self and inferiority of the other. So I'm sure you've also heard about the Aryan race, which Hitler so much wanted to promulgate during the 1940s, and that when the Second World War took place, and he felt that all individuals with blonde hair and blue eyes are superior to other people. And what he started doing was he started persecuting also the disabled people within his country, because he felt that those are reject individuals. So then you get a concept called envious prejudice, which says that all Asians are, for example, intelligent, and when they have jobs, a jobless person would say they are taking our jobs, for example, because they are intelligent, and so that is envious prejudice. And that racism is also something where people are complaining of other people coming to take their jobs and all that. and it's also concept where black foreigners experience discrimination. But then if you look at it, white foreigners don't experience that discrimination, because white foreigners can come into the country and get jobs in that, and they are not discriminated against. Then in terms of managing racial and ethnic diversity in South African organizations, within South Africa, transformation has to take place, and in certain organizations it has taken place at a much quicker rate compared to other organizations. And then diversity interventions also have to be meaningful, and they should also not only focus on race and gender, but they should also focus on other aspects and elements of diversity. And they shouldn't be superficial, and they should not socially exclude certain groups. So when you do diversity interventions in it, it should be at a high level, and it should be all inclusive. So in terms of critical diversity literacy, there are 10 criteria. First of all, you have to have an understanding of the role of power in constructing difference that makes a difference. So we have to understand that not all differences are equal. So sometimes gender differences might not disadvantage women to such a great extent as would maybe differences in sexual orientation. So in terms of that, the role of power in constructing difference then obviously is different. Then secondly, a recognition of the different and unequal and symbolic value of different social locations and identities, for example, whiteness and masculinity. The differences in matter shape the values and norms of our organization. So, for example, if you take Eurocentric dress, your hair, etc., are seen as a norm. Whiteness and masculinity also is seen as a norm. So, women who aspire to become managers in corporate South Africa have to have certain masculine characteristics. For example, they have to learn to be very straightforward in their talk. They have to be assertive in their behavior in that. And sometimes women's leadership qualities of being more understanding and embracing, and people who are more concerned with other people's feelings in that, and display empathy in that, are not actually regarded as a norm. So those are things that have to also be accounted for when doing critical diversity literacy. Then the third element is analytic skill in unpacking how these systems of oppression intersect, interlock, and co-construct. So we got to see how a race intersects maybe with gender, or gender and sexual orientation, or gender, sexual orientation, and disability intersect. So we look at all the different identities, and we see how all these identities come together, and sometimes they lead to a level of privilege when they intersect. So if, for example, you are a white male in an organization, you will have more privilege compared to an Indian female, for example. Then a definition of oppressive systems such as racism as current social problems and not only a historical legacy, locates its engagement of diversity from within a historical understanding of how certain differences have come to matter, and specifically how that history matters now. So here we also talk about our past history and how certain elements within society and within organizations have been structured, and still that historical elements still coexist and still influence a lot of decisions in our workplaces in this current day and age. Although we have moved away from the apartheid era, it's already 26, 27 years, but we still have that legacy of apartheid within our organizations, and it still matters in this day and age. Then the fifth one is an understanding that social identities are learned and an outcome of current social practices. Yes, definitely, any social identity is learned and socially constructed. So social identities, for example, race, ethnicity, culture, religion, those are things that when you were born, you didn't automatically know it. You were socialized into learning certain things. You were socialized into learning that I'm of a certain race group. You are socialized into learning that if I'm of a certain race group, I will have certain privileges. And I can walk into any organization and I can walk into any business, and people will respect me because of my racial identity. So those are things that you learn as a result of being socialized, and this thing socialized into understanding your privileges, your advantages and disadvantages within society. Then number 6 deals with the possession of a diversity grammar and vocabulary that facilitates a discussion of privilege and oppression. So you have to be able to name the dynamics of relationships of difference before you can even identify them. So identifying them is the first step to being able to challenge them. So if you can identify what the problems are, that's the only time you're going to be able to challenge the status quo. So within an organization as well, you need to become aware of what these uh, challenges are, and what are microaggressive behaviors. You need to be able to know what are subtle everyday racial remarks. So once you understand how people use words to actually bring other people down and to humiliate other people, there's the only time you will be able to challenge all these types of behaviors, negative behaviors in the workplace. Then number 7, the ability to translate or see through and interpret coded hegemonic practice. So understanding racism is not simply as overt hateful interaction, but is embedded in well-intentioned everyday practice, which includes some and excludes others. For example, microaggressions. Like I said before, these are practices that are within organizations, and they not always overt, but they sometimes happen in such a it happens in such a subtle manner that it takes the listener and the person, the target, actually sometimes hours or even days before you realize, you know what, I was actually a victim of racism. So you need to be able to pick up on these things. I don't say you must be overly sensitive now, but you need to be able to understand the language that's taking place within organizations to actually um, insult you and to bring you down. I don't say everybody does it, but when people do it, you should be able to pick up on it very quickly. And that is why you got to learn to be a good listener, and understand the language that is being used to undermine uh, your um, your status within the organization, and also in your intelligence as well. Then number 8 is analytic skills, which identify the way diversity hierarchies and institutionalized oppressions are inflected through specific social contexts and material arrangements. So sometimes our social and cultural differences are linked to material realities. So we're going to ensure that we are true to ourselves, and for example, if you want to dress in a certain way, in an ethnic way, in an organization, sometimes it is frowned upon. And because, for example, if you're an Indian woman and your natural dress, your ethnic dress is very colorful, and you come into the organization in it, you will definitely not be seen as management material. So those are things that are material realities, and social and cultural differences are linked to it. But you know for a fact that you're going to come dressed in somber looking, dull looking clothes and that, but you come there every day brightly with a bright pink lipstick and bright pink clothes and all that. People are not going to take you seriously. So you got to kind of follow the norms in it, even if it goes sometimes against your own cultural and your ethnic beliefs. So then number 9 is an understanding of the role of emotions, including your own emotional investment. And then we need to also know that all identities are emotionally sustained. So you're going to gauge people's emotions as well. And there are people who are overly sensitive within the workplace, and there are people who come in with personal problems as well within the organization. And obviously they drain you emotionally, they drain you. But then obviously your emotional stability and your emotional state can also have an impact on individuals that you are working with. So you need to be able to come into the organization and try and leave personal problems at home, and try and behave in a professional manner. Do work and behave in a professional manner at work, and leave problems behind and solve them out and throw all your toys out of the cot at home. But don't bring your emotional baggage to the workplace, because that also sometimes is people bring their emotional baggage to work, and they say and do things that are hurtful to other people as well. So we need to understand our own emotional state as well as the role of emotions, and how other people become very emotional at the workplace and bring their baggage to the workplace. Then in engagement with the transformation of these oppressive systems towards deepening social justice at all levels of a social organization. So the commitment to transformation at all levels of the organization. Organization should be equipped and willing to change at all levels, and it should be a top-down approach but also a bottom-up approach, so it should work both ways. It's no use managers try and do things, and then you get employees at the bottom trying to cause so much of havoc at the bottom that things just don't work out. Okay, so that ends the slides for chapter 4, and we will go on to the next chapter. Thank you for your attention.